Hi, this week I'd like to take a look at a passage that's well known, talked about all the time in the church, and I think we need to take just a closer look at it to see one or two more things we might normally miss. I want to look at the story of the Good Samaritan. It's in the Gospel according to Luke, chapter 10, verses 25 to 37. It's really well known in the church that the story goes along, and there's a man who is on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he is happened upon by a group of robbers, and he is beaten and left bloody and dying on the side of the road. And along comes a priest. And the priest sees the man, and rather than helping him, crosses the road to the other side, and then passes by as far away from this man as he can. And then along comes another man who's a Levite, and this Levite again sees the man, but then crosses deliberately to the other side of the road to cross as far away from him as possible. And then over time, eventually, a Samaritan comes. And this is trading on this idea that the Jews and the Samaritans did not get along well. In fact, it's very likely that this Jewish man probably saw the Samaritan as a half-breed, as someone who is somehow worse than and not worthy of his attention, not treated a fellow humanity with the Jew. Well, in any case, this Samaritan comes along, and he picks this man up, he puts him on his donkey, so he has to walk himself, he takes him to an inn, he pays for his well-being for the next several days, and then says, if there's any more expense, don't kick him out, charge it to my account, and I will pay it when I come back. And so this is a very evocative story. And how do we often talk about it in the church? How is it preached in sermons? How do we approach this thing? Well, the question is usually raised, at least in my experience, the preacher will ask, who are you in this story? And you're given three options. Are you the priest? Are you the Levite? Or are you the Samaritan? When you see someone in need, do you help that person like you know you should, or do you pass by on the other side and avoid it when the situation arises? And regardless of how the preacher gets there, the end result is essentially it's obvious that the Samaritan is the one who has done the right thing. And so we should go and be like the Samaritan. In fact, Jesus says at the very end of the story, he says, go and do likewise. Now, like any presentation of any story in the Bible, some presentations are better than others. And the better presentations will also include a few other facts that seem to be very relevant to our understanding of how the story plays itself out. And one of those is that this road from Jerusalem to Jericho was notoriously dangerous. And so a person lying on the side of the road, apparently beaten and bloodied and perhaps dying or already dead, would not have been an entirely unusual sight on that particular road. The better presentations of this story will also admit the fact that on this notoriously dangerous road, every once in a while you have someone who's from a band of robbers who will pose as someone who has been beaten and bloodied, and use that as a way to entice people to come over, try to help them, and then make themselves, the one who would try to help, the kind-hearted person, a victim of these other robbers. And so what that at least does is that begins to paint the portrayal of the priest and the Levite, if not as good and right, at least certainly as understandable, because there's enough of a danger of going up to someone who seems to be hurt, that if they're alive, they may actually be posing as a way to do harm to you too. And so it helps explain why they cross to the other side of the road to get away from it. It also helps to show us that in some cases we might also be tempted to do exactly the same thing that the priest and the Levite did. That if there was a non-trivial chance that we would be abused and attacked and robbed in our attempts to help someone, we might also try to hedge our bets and seek safety rather than to put ourselves at risk. At the very least, then, this passage should go to help illuminate the fact that our desire to do good to people, our desire to show compassion on those who are in serious situations, is not always as simple as it may at first seem, because it doesn't take very many people posing as harmed people on the side of the road to significantly discourage people from showing kindness to them. In the same way, you find that some people want to do good to people, but they're so worried about it being used to bad effect. Now, the fact of the matter that there are relatively very few people who actually try to abuse systems of charity doesn't stop the fact that the ones we hear about are so contrary to the kinds of things that we value that it sometimes scares people off. There's a great deal about that traditional interpretation of the story of the Good Samaritan that is good and must be preserved. But there is one detail that seems to get missed pretty consistently. And it starts off because before Jesus tells a story, this is the context that comes right before it. We read, "And a lawyer stood up and put him to the test, saying, 'Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?' And he, Jesus, said to him, 'What is written in the law? How does it read to you?' And he answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your minds, and as your neighbor as yourself." And Jesus said to him, "You have answered correctly. Do this and you will live." But, wishing to justify himself, he said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" I started paying attention to this part of the story because of what I was reading in Karl Barth's Church Dogmatics. And so I want to read to you one of the things that he said on this passage. He said, "We might expect, and current exegesis of the text is in accordance with this obvious expectation, that Jesus would have said to the teacher of the law, 'This Samaritan did not ask questions like you. He found his neighbor in the man that had fallen among the thieves. He treated him accordingly. Go and do likewise.'" But his point is that the question began by the man trying to justify himself. He wants to excuse himself in some way. And he points out that at the very end of the passage, he begins by saying, "Who is my neighbor?" And Jesus ends his story by saying, "Which of these three do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell into the robber's hands?" So you see, we are in the story. It's just that it's not where we thought we were. We are so often given the choice of, are you going to be like the priest, like the Levite, or like the Samaritan? As if first and foremost, our place in the story was one that we chose. What Jesus is saying to this lawyer who wants to justify himself is, you are in this story. You are one of these four men, but it's not the three you think. You are the man who is beaten, who has been attacked, who has been abused, who is helpless, who is weak, who needs to receive help. The question becomes at that point, not who are you willing to help, but from whom are you willing to receive help? And if we think about that for a bit, it becomes clear that that is a much more offensive, much more bothersome kind of interpretation. Because if I see myself as being a well-respected, well-to-do person who has many things and is not in need of help from other people, I can look out and I can see the needy as a class of people that I'm not a part of, and that I can go and kind of stoop down and help those with my resources. What Jesus is saying is, I'm the one who needs help. We are the ones who find ourselves in a needy situation. And so the question is, from whom are we willing to help? And if the person who's willing to help is the person we don't like, if the person who has harmed us in the past, the person who believes something very strange or even heretical about the gospel, if we are willing to receive help from those whom God sends, who are we willing to humble ourselves to allow ourselves to be helped by? Because this Jewish man who fell into the hands of robbers would have seen the Samaritan as being someone beneath contempt. And yet he's asked, will you receive help? Will you receive the aid that you need, even if it comes from a Samaritan? And so perhaps the value of thinking who might be the equivalent to the Samaritan in your life still holds value. Because who is it who, if they were the one who presumed to help you, would make you feel uncomfortable? Who is it that if they were to say, you need my help, you would be offended by that idea? How could they think that they were the ones who could help me? And when we find out who that is, then all of a sudden this passage takes on a new depth of meaning. And all of a sudden it cuts a little closer to our hearts and to our lives and to our own stubbornness. Now, we should still, of course, try to be like the Samaritan, but raising this point has changed the way I engage with this passage, and it helps me to pay attention to more of the context of the well-known passages that I otherwise would just read over without thinking. So that's all for this week. If you have any questions, if you have any topics you'd like me to consider, if you have a passage you'd like to study together, please send me an email at pastorstevik@gmail.com, and I'll try to get into the rotation, and I look forward to seeing you next time.